Welcome back to another Revealer Films video clip. Have you ever wished that you could do something to put an end to the suffering in this world? Well, you can, and I'll explain how in just a moment. As Adventists, we know that Jesus promised to come back and put an end to the suffering and pain in this world. We are Adventists because we believe this truth. It's embedded in our very name, and our existence depends upon it. But have you ever wondered why Jesus is taking so long? As the years drag on and the cry of this earth gets louder and louder, why doesn't he just come and put an end to it all? Why does the pain continue? Well, the truth of the matter is that no one wants to put an end to the suffering in this world more than God does. He feels the combined pain of this world in a way that we will never understand. God is just dying to put an end to it all. In fact, we have been in this old world for over 100 years, too long. You see, over 100 years ago, God's people had a chance to go home. I'm going to share with you a bit of history today, because this is important. If we understand history, we can learn from it and save ourselves from making the same mistakes. In the mid-1800s, a movement was started by the preaching of a man by the name of William Miller. This movement swept the world and became the largest movement in history, focusing on the second coming of Jesus. They believed that Jesus was going to come back to the earth in the year 1844. Though they did not know it at the time, they were actually heralding the start of the most critical time period in the plan of redemption. Not the second coming of Christ, but the last phase of his work in the heavenly sanctuary. It's called the investigative judgment. This work involved two things: the blotting out of the sins of God's faithful people from the books of heaven, and the character perfection of his people on earth. It was the beginning of a very special time of preparation for God's people. Preparation of their hearts to receive the outpouring of the Holy Spirit so they could give the third angel's message with power, enabling it to swell to a loud cry. This loud cry, referring to the parable of the 10 virgins, would be the last warning message to the world. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was raised up from the Millerite movement to herald this important time period. This did not need to take long. In fact, Ellen White wrote in 1850, just 6 years after 1844, "I saw the time for Jesus to be in the most holy place was nearly finished, and that time can last but a very little longer." But time passed. Some of God's people yielded their faith to doubt, and others got involved in theological controversy, and they stopped giving the third angel's message, which was to prepare the world for the second advent. Thus, they delayed the coming of Christ. The church was officially organized in 1863. More years went by and God was still waiting. As the 1800s drew to a close, God was preparing to send his church a very special message that, if allowed to do its work, would have brought them back on track and enabled them to give the last warning message to the world. But Satan was also there trying to stop God's plans. In 1886, controversy broke out between E.J. Wagner, editor of the Signs of the Times magazine, and Uriah Smith, editor of the Review and Herald. The debate was over the law in Galatians. Was it the moral law or was it the ceremonial law? This debate went round and round and round and got quite heated. This was the backdrop of the 1888 General Conference session. Theological debate. As a result, many of the leading men had bitter feelings towards Wagner and his colleague Jones. But as God would have it, Jones and Wagner were giving the morning devotional talks at the General Conference session. God had given these men a special message to his church. It was the message of righteousness by faith, which is the gospel in its simplest form, which had been lost sight of by the early church in their zeal for upholding the law. But sadly, many of the church leaders closed their minds to Jones and Wagner because of the theological differences they had. Ellen White describes the meeting thus: "I shall never, I think, be called to stand under the direction of the Holy Spirit as I stood in Minneapolis. The presence of Jesus was with me, and all assembled in the meeting had opportunity to place themselves on the side of truth by receiving the Holy Spirit, which was sent by God in such a rich current of love and mercy. But in the rooms occupied by some of our people was heard ridicule, criticism, jeering, laughter. The manifestations of the Holy Spirit were attributed to fanaticism. Many of the people mocked and ridiculed Jones and Wagner, rather than letting the message of righteousness by faith take root in their hearts. In fact, Ellen White said later in a letter, "I have been instructed that the terrible experience at the Minneapolis Conference is one of the saddest chapters in the history of believers of present truth." There was no official vote that said, "No, we do not accept this message." It wasn't even part of the agenda. It was just the morning devotional talks. But because of the strife and hardness of their hearts, the message did not take root as it should have. They actually resisted the work of the Holy Spirit. Little did they realize at the time the implications of what they had done. Speaking of their resistance of this message, Ellen White wrote, "The light which was to lighten the whole earth with its glory was resisted, and by the action of our own brethren has been in a great degree kept from the world." This light, referred to in Revelation 18, was the power of the Holy Spirit, which was to join the third angel's message and swell to a loud cry, the last warning message to the world. Referring to the message of 1888, Ellen White wrote, "It is the third angel's message, which is to be proclaimed with a loud voice and attended with the outpouring of his Spirit in a large measure." In fact, Ellen White said that the message of Jones and Wagner was, quote, "the third angel's message in verity." This 1888 message was the beginnings of the loud cry message, the final message to the world before Jesus comes back. But the third angel's message did not have its proper effect, and the fourth angel had to return. A few years later, Ellen White penned these sad words, "We may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination many more years, as did the children of Israel." In other words, we as a church did not submit to the authority of God. The only way that this message of righteousness by faith can have its proper effect is if we would humble our hearts before God and allow Him to take throne of our hearts. What is justification by faith? It is the work of God in laying the glory of man in the dust, and doing for man that which it is not in his own power to do for himself. So why did the message of righteousness by faith fail to bring on the loud cry like it was intended to? Because we as a church were not willing to allow God to do His work of laying our pride in the dust. But I have a question for you. How many of us have intellectually accepted the message of righteousness by faith that was rejected in 1888, but are still rejecting it today by clinging to our pride? Until God has a generation of people that are willing to let go of their pride and fully surrender themselves to Him so that He can live His life in them, He will wait. Jesus can't come back. Why? Because God needs to win the great controversy. Listen to this statement. Christ is waiting with longing desire for the manifestation of Himself in His church. When the character of the Saviour shall be perfectly reproduced in His people, then He will come to claim His own. It is the privilege of every Christian not only to look for, but to hasten the coming of the Lord. Were all who profess His name bearing fruit to His glory, how quickly the whole earth would be sown with the gospel seed. Quickly the last great harvest would be ripened, and Christ would come. Learning to be dead is the secret to living the life of righteousness by faith. First dying to my old life, and then living the life of faith, the life of Christ. If you want to learn more about this message, check out my previous video called Faith Like a Space Shuttle. This was the message that was lost in 1888. Though many of the leaders may have verbally accepted the truth, it has not been preached the way it should have, and it has not taken root in people's hearts. This is not a theoretical gospel. It is a gospel that you must live. Because of that, we're still here. So, we end, as we began, with the question, do you wish you could put an end to the suffering in this world? Well, you can. We can. In fact, 2 Peter 3, verse 12 tells us that we are to not only look for the second coming, but we are to hasten it. As Adventists, we are very good at looking for the Lord's coming, but are we by our lives hastening His coming? So the ball is in our court. Jesus is waiting. All creation is waiting. The suffering people in this world are waiting. The question remains, will you and I step up to the plate? Will we take this matter seriously, deny ourselves, and let God lay our glory in the dust, to put our flesh to death and to live the life of Christ? If we will do this, we'll be home in no time.